Hello again guys, and welcome back to another Big Al Devlin video, and today we're going to be starting a new series on pugilism. What is pugilism? Well, pugilism is essentially the origin of modern day boxing. It itself was its own sport. In many ways, actually, you could describe boxing, modern day boxing, which of course we're all familiar with, as pugilism also. It is essentially the same sport. However, of course, the history of boxing and the origin of boxing, more to the point, is obviously a lot more brutal than as it is today. Of course, it was bare-knuckle boxing, and there were additional rules. And what I want to do over this series, this will be a long-standing series, is share with you readings from manuals, fighting manuals written by championship boxers of the time from the early 1700s, and go through time essentially, analysing how the fighting techniques over time changed and adapted and developed, and actually do demonstrations of how these techniques are still applicable to today's fights. What we'll also do is we'll actually look at actual footage also. There's not a lot for obvious reasons, and there is no footage, of course, from the original fights in the early 1700s, but we do have some footage from the 1900s, obviously, and also the late 1800s. So we've got plenty of footage to go through, and eventually what we'll do is we'll move into the early era of boxing, and those who still used a lot of the common techniques used in pugilism to boxing to great effect. Of course, one of those main ones would be Jack Dempsey, who himself was a bare-knuckle fighter who went also into boxing and proved that pugilistic techniques are very, very effective. I suppose the best place to start when we look at the history of boxing is to look up something that, again, we're all familiar with. On the screen in front of you, you'll see and have seen various photos come up of original pugilistic fighters in their traditional fight stance. Now you look at this, and especially compared to, as I say, modern day boxing, you go, how is that effective? It looks a bit silly, a little goofy, right? Why aren't they protecting their head? And why have they got their arms stuck out so far? And these are actually really excellent questions to ask, because in a modern day fight, of course, they would put perhaps a pugilist fighting under modern rules at a disadvantage against a modern boxer. However, it's really important to say that if a modern boxer fought in a pugilistic fighter under old pugilistic rules, they themselves would also be under serious trouble by using a modern day boxing guard against a pugilist. So what I'm saying is that guard existed for a very specific reason. It is highly defensive and protects against the rule set that pugilists fought under during the period of time that they fought. And so let's analyse why they use this, because that will give us the very basics on the history of pugilism, and we'll go from there on how boxing, or pugilism at this point, was evolved into something much more akin to modern day boxing also. And the most pertinent, most obvious fact of difference between modern day boxing and pugilistic fighting is that, of course, in pugilism there would be no wearing of gloves. And of course, by saying that, bare-knuckle fighting, is regarded in modern day times by the mass majority of people as being something really brutal, really dangerous, and horrifically painful. And of course, those people wouldn't be wrong. It is. But, as paradoxical as it's going to sound, boxing without gloves is actually considered to be safer than boxing with them. You see, by lacking protective hand gear such as gloves, wraps, so on and so forth, punching someone in the head with literally every ounce of your physical might is actually a very good way to seriously injure your hands, particularly when you do it repeatedly. And don't get me wrong, head strikes are very much used in bare-knuckle fighting. A favoured target, in fact, of a pugilistic fighter, believe it or not, is actually the cheekbone, not the jaw, but the cheekbone. But the head was by no means a focus. In fact, instead it was the body. Why? Because, believe it or not, it's actually easier to stop a very big, strong man with a body blow than it is to strike them in the head. It takes a lot of damage to knock a heavyweight out. You see this in modern day boxing. Heavyweight boxers who can hit really hard rarely get a one hit knockout. It takes them multiple rounds of hitting the head again and again and again and again. And you can imagine doing that with a bare fist. Well, it's one sure ticket to breaking your hand. Now, you combine this with the fact that many old pugilistic fighters competed multiple times a week, most of them having competitive fights 2 to 3 times a week. It becomes very obvious to see why strikes to the body were favoured heavily over strikes to the head. And it's probably because of this reason that a lot of pugilists, despite the frequency in which they fought, despite fighting with bare knuckle, were actually able to fight and continue their fighting career for up to sometimes 3 decades. All the while maintaining their mental faculties well into old age. So this goes some of the way to explain why, when we look at the old-time photographs of and illustrations of pugilists in their fight stance, we see that the hands are actually a lot lower than in comparison to modern-day boxers. They cover the body, and that's pretty obvious why, because the body, of course, was the main focus for strikes in pugilism. However, one thing that I will note and will say now, as you'll discover as the series goes on, we start talking about the techniques used to attack your opponent whilst also maintaining your own defense. These guys didn't stay like this the whole way through the fight. They did protect their head, particularly when they knew it was exposed. As I say, they were not avert in any way whatsoever to go for a cheeky, cheek shot, quite literally. They were quite happy to go for cheek shots, okay? And so if you presented them with a target, they would take it. So you had to still maintain some head defense, some head guard, but we'll go into that into more detail later on in this video, but also in other videos to come. Now, pugilism in its real true origins, that is prior to 1743. We'll discuss that year in just a moment, but prior to that year of 1743, there were very few, if any, rules implemented in pugilism. Punching was not the only way in which you could strike and hurt your opponent. In fact, commonly used techniques were eye gouging, choking, obviously punching, headbutting, and other basic street fighting tactics. And in fact, even as I say, after 1743, not all of these were actually phased out. A lot of street fighting tactics were still used in pugilism. The main street fighting technique of which was allowed to continue post 1743 was grappling. Now, I'm not talking necessarily the kind of grappling you get in MMA, for example, because of course ground fighting wasn't really done in pugilism. Prior to 1743, when you put your opponent to the ground, whether you knocked them out or whether you threw them onto the ground, yes, you could stamp them, you could punch them, and you could keep striking them until basically they were comatose, at which point you won the fight. But post 1743, ground strikes were not allowed. However, what you could do with the grappling techniques, as I say, the street fighting grappling techniques that were allowed to continue within pugilism, was to grab your opponent by the head, pin them, and hold their head in position as you struck them to the face. And so I know I said earlier that pugilist fighters didn't often go for head strikes, certainly to the same degree of frequency as modern day boxers, but if they got you in this kind of position, which was something that they strove to do, they wanted to pin you, they wanted to grab you and grapple you and do something like this because of course it's so devastating. Well, you know, yes, head strikes were obviously used in this case, and we see a true example of this in the defeat of Daniel Mendoza, who was one of the greatest champions in pugilistic fighting of all time. And in fact, we will be reading directly from one of his own manuals and training manuals that he wrote within this series. But he himself lost his title of champion after a 5-year victory streak, after he himself had his hair grabbed and was pummeled in such a manner. So yes, hair grabbing was still allowed, and yes, this was seen as now a civilized sport in comparison to how it used to be. And so yes, in 1743 there was a formalized rule set developed and published by an individual called Jack Broughton. And Jack Broughton himself, in fact, was actually a pugilistic fighter, And the impetus for him to actually bring these rules into effect came in part following Broughton defeating a man called George Stephenson. George Stephenson would actually suffer such severe injuries during the fight that he actually died a few days afterwards. Now this saddened very much Jack Broughton, who then was determined to minimise the harsher aspects of the sport and to make it civilised, at least to the degree of the times. And so he introduced the Broughton rules. Amongst these rules, it now was forbidden to strike below the belt. This was a common tactic back in original pugilism fights, to strike to the groin, for obvious reasons. Also, you were no longer allowed to hit a competitor when he was down. You had to give him 30 seconds to recover and then to continue the fight. If he was unable to continue after these 30 seconds, he would then be, of course, declared the loser. Obviously, the predecessor to the 10-second count that exists in modern day boxing. But one of the key differences in pugilistic fighting that still existed at this point was there were no timed rounds. Instead, you would fight and continue fighting until one of you, either yourself or your opponent, was downed, typically by a knockdown or a knockout, but it could sometimes, of course, be from during the grappling if you were thrown to the ground. That would then give you the 30-second count. And one of the other key facts about pugilism was there was no limit to the number of rounds you could fight. In fact, the longest recorded pugilistic fight to have occurred lasted 111 rounds, which lasted just over 7 hours. Now, in the 111th round, the fight was ended as a draw because literally neither fighter could literally throw a punch at one another anymore. Quite understandably, yes. And even more so when you consider that in the previous 110 rounds, each one of those rounds was ended with a knockdown. Can you imagine, even if it was split evenly between them, being knocked out 55 times in a single day? These men were incredibly tough, and so when you see the photos like I'm displaying here, or on Google and things like this, a lot of people, they kind of laugh and go, oh, aren't they silly and goofy, as I say. These men were truly tough. They were true fighters, and certainly not someone you would want to mess around with. Right guys, I'm just going to end the video now because I feel that you've probably heard a little bit too much of my voice. I still have a few things to talk about related to the introduction to pugilism, but most of what I've got left to talk about is actually talking about Daniel Mendoza himself. He was, as I say, one of the greatest champions of pugilism, and he introduced the concept of what you can see on these photos of the left hand being extended, because at this point in time, where I just ended the video talking about Broughton and that, as the fighters back then typically didn't actually extend just their left arm, but they extended both arms at this point because they obviously wanted to create as much distance between themselves and their opponents as a resistance and a deterrent for grappling. As I say, it was Mendoza that introduced this dominant hand brought back and tucked around your chin or around your body, and your left hand extended, which of course really is the foundations of, in many respects, a lot of the modern day boxing stances. And that's why he's such a great champion, because he really started to introduce a lot of the modern concepts that we see today, including head movement. But we'll talk about him next video, and then what we'll do is after that we'll probably start reading from his manual, where he literally teaches you or talks about why he does certain things, what techniques he's introduced into boxing, and how they should be performed. And it's really an interesting read. And what I'll do is when I'm reading it, I won't change it or anything. I'll literally read it word for word, so it might be a little bit hard to follow because it's a bit almost like a Shakespearean play, right? It's worded in a manner that's a little unusual for today, but it's still easy enough to follow. So I hope you enjoyed the series, the introduction to this new series, guys. I certainly enjoyed filming it. I'll see you soon. So bye bye, and thanks for tuning in.